record the computer. Okay. All right, go ahead, Cameron. It's yours.
All right. Well, thank you guys all for joining us today. The last time we had one of these meetings, some of you were here. We talked a little bit about how the anti-GMO movement has been so successful, and this time I want to follow up with just more of a broader outlook on where we are with crop biotechnology 26 years on, because the initial products were mostly commercialized in 1996. So I want to look at where we are with the science, what kind of applications are coming online, and what are the economic benefits of growing and consuming biotech crops. And then I also want to wrap up by looking at where the anti-GMO movement is today. But let's go back just a few years and recap where things were. So you may remember Neil Young, who's also been in the news more recently, but he was on Stephen Colbert's late night show talking about or alleging that GMO corn causes all sorts of serious diseases. And he was bragging that they had been banned or all GMO crops had been banned in 38 countries. And he was harassing the public to support a ban here in the US. And then we had, right around 2015, we had March Against Monsanto protests all over the world, thousands of people in major cities gathering to oppose this technology. And then even in the science communication world, we had big names expressing concern about biotech crops. So Bill Nye, the science guy, who, I think every child around 8th grade learns who this gentleman is, but he was very publicly saying, I'm concerned about the environmental impacts of this technology. And most of these sentiments have really dissipated. And it's primarily because of the three things I want to talk about today. But the basic is that the disaster never came. There's never been any serious health effects linked to crop biotechnology. There's never been any serious environmental impacts. And of course, the anti-GMO movement has sort of lost its footing. They're trying to regain it. They're having some success, particularly in the courts, which we can talk about later. But for the most part, they're trying to get back to where they were. And so overall, I think these are very, very positive developments. And as fans of science and fans of technology and innovation, we should be happy and even thrilled about this. So let's take these each in turn. And I want to start with, where is the technology? What are some of the innovations that are coming to market or have been approved? So the first one that is interesting to me, primarily because no one really noticed it, is that in 2019, Calyx, they're the Minnesota-based biotech company, they commercialized a gene-edited soy variety. It's supposedly heart healthier. It has no trans fats. It has higher oleic acid content. And it was commercialized primarily for use as fry oil. It was used in the restaurants in the Midwest. And it got a little bit of pushback when it was commercialized from the environmental groups, but no one else noticed. And in 2020, once the pandemic got underway, there was a pretty big soy shortage. It was the biggest one in years. And Calyx stepped into the breach, and they sold the entire crop to Archer Daniels Midland, and it alleviated the crisis. And obviously, people had bigger concerns at the beginning of 2020 when this took place, but nobody cared, right? No one noticed that their food supply had changed at all. No one said, hey, wait a minute, this is a different soy or whatever. It just didn't matter. And that's primarily because, as all of you know very well, the end product is generally not affected by the breeding method that produces the crop. So I love that example just because nobody knows about it. And then in last September, there's a biotech firm in Japan called Sanitec, and they commercialized a new tomato variety. It's called a Sicilian Rouge High GABA. And GABA is just an amino acid. It plays a variety of important roles in our health, but it can lower blood pressure. And so the idea is you put this tomato into the food supply and people can eat it as part of a healthy diet, and it reduces their risk of developing high blood pressure. And again, we got a little pushback from the anti-biotech groups, in particular GM Watch in the UK, tried to put up a fuss about it, but they really couldn't say anything. All they could say was, well, we have GABA supplements and we have tomatoes, so why do we need this? And the answer, of course, is that not everyone can consume supplements. And more importantly, tomato is very popular globally. Everyone in the world eats tomato. So if you want something that's practical, that's affordable, as a way to reduce the risk of high blood pressure, this is a great way to do it, a biofortified crop. It was early in the year, Sanitech, they sent out 5,000 seedlings to people in Japan. They just say, hey, take this, tell us what you think about it. And that sort of trial run went so well that in September, they started just selling the tomatoes online to customers in Japan. So I'm not sure when that'll be available in other countries. But again, this is a pretty big development. It's a gene edited crop. It's one of the few that's been commercialized globally or internationally rather. And again, there's been really no pushback. And then just two more examples, and these are probably the most significant. The first being Aqua Bounty's Aqua Advantage Salmon has been available in the US now for almost a year. And major seafood distributors signed on to distribute it to restaurants and to grocery stores. It's not available everywhere, but there are some places you can start finding it. I think particularly on the East Coast, it's easier to get now. But for over 2 decades, Aqua Bounty was hung up in a regulatory fight because the activist groups were so influential. They even put pressure on the Obama administration to halt this development, even after the FDA said, this is okay, there's nothing wrong with this. But the administration forced the FDA to do another environmental impact assessment. And predictably, it came back, there's no problem. These fish, they're grown in landlocked tanks. There's redundant security measures on top of redundant security measures. But they had blocked it successfully for many years. And now it's just available. And again, there's no crisis. Nobody's died from eating this fish because there's nothing in it that could harm anybody. And then most significantly, this is the example I love the most. The Philippines just announced a few weeks ago that they're about to start massive production of golden rice seed. And if you're not familiar with golden rice, it's a beta carotene fortified rice variety. The idea is to prevent or to treat vitamin A deficiency in the Philippines and Bangladesh primarily, but there's many thousands of children that go blind every year. They end up dying very, very early and totally unnecessarily because of vitamin A deficiency. And Greenpeace, for all the things they do that I dislike, this is the worst because they spent years pressuring these governments. They're saying, look, this is dangerous. It hasn't been studied. There's going to be severe health effects. And the data just don't support that. I mean, the FDA has looked at this. Health Canada has looked at it. I believe the European Food Safety Authority, I believe the EPA in Australia and New Zealand. So there's multiple regulatory agencies. There's study after study after study after study looking at golden rice. And there's no reason to think that there's anything wrong with it. But finally, this is going to get to the people that it was designed to help. And it's been, I want to say, roughly 30 years now of just fight after fight. But the point is that these are all coming to market or they are available to consumers, and they're primarily consumer-facing products. So in the mid-1990s, the early 2000s, the anti-GMO groups, they could say, look, this is dangerous technology. These are frankenfoods. They're trying to sneak them into your food supply. They're meant to increase pesticide use. Now, those are all false. But there's a certain plausibility to the average consumer who's not familiar with the scientific issues. But with these products, a tomato that has more of an amino acid, nothing really scary about that. Or, a fish that grows faster. And there's nothing, it's like, oh, the horror, salmon's more affordable now. So this is a big deal. And if you're familiar with the discussions around these technologies, this is a very common argument that you'll hear is that when things are consumer facing, the benefits are right in front of people's faces. And it's harder to say that this technology is bad. So I think that's a significant development, and it's pushing us in the right direction. Now, on the economic side of things, I think this is really important. It's more subtle, but as the evidence accumulates, it gets harder for activist groups, for politicians, to deny the benefits of crop biotechnology. So I have in mind a pretty significant review. It was published in 2020 by the economists Graham Brooks and Peter Barefoot. They're at PG Economics in the United Kingdom. And they just looked at the economic benefits of growing just the first generation of genetically modified crops. And what they found is that from 1996 to 2018, farmers who utilized this technology earned an extra $225 billion. Now, I think we all know how much money that is, but just to, in practice, to understand the benefit of that, it's enormous. So particularly in the developing world, on the margin, an extra dollar is very, very important. It could be the difference between someone sending their children to school or keeping them home to pull weeds. And then if they're making more money, that means they can save more money. It means they can reinvest in better technology. Of course, that means they can go buy other goods and services. So this is an engine of economic growth, and it starts primarily with the poorest people in these developing countries. And you can't underscore the significance of that or minimize the significance of that. I'll talk a little bit later about how that undermines the case the activists are trying to make. But it's primarily because they have to spend less on fuel, they have to spend less on pesticides, so their production costs go down, but then their yields are increasing as well. So we're getting more food for less. And on the consumer side of this, these reduced costs are passed on in the form of lower food prices. And just late last year, the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology, they put out a report, and they said that GMOs globally, if you just look at the prices that people pay for food globally, they push down food prices about $24 billion per year. And it's just primarily due to these production cost declines. Now, Cass did a couple other things in the study I'm talking about. They modeled the economic loss, just to say if like a major food producer like the US was just to ban this technology. It's not going to happen, but they were just to make a point. They said it would boost food prices by roughly $14 billion a year, and the cost to the US economy would be somewhere between 200 million and 4.9 billion annually. It's just an enormous loss. But the idea is to set up sort of an A/B comparison. So you look at the real results that have been generated because of this technology, and then you look at this model that they put together to say, when you don't have this technology, this is what happens. So everybody's poorer, and probably more importantly, there's health risks associated with this. And people don't think about this because it's sort of like Henry Hazlitt back in the day said, there's the seen and the unseen. And when something is not in front of their faces, people don't realize the costs of a policy. So if you think about the biofortified foods like golden rice that we mentioned, people that get sick because of vitamin A deficiency, they require healthcare. Of course, they're not going to school, they're not working, so they're not contributing to their society. And then, of course, most tragically, many of them are dying long before their time. So this is a significant cost to society just in terms of healthcare. And the same thing with insect-resistant crops. So BT crops are the best known example. But one of the benefits of this technology is it reduces insect damage to crops. And then when they're not damaged by the insects, they don't develop these cancer-causing molds. They're called mycotoxins, very, very deadly. But in Africa in particular, you get mycotoxins in the food supply, and you get a measurable increase in cancer cases. So with more farmers growing these crops, get a reduction in cancer, which of course not a cheap disease to treat. Again, it keeps people from working, and then if it kills them, then they're permanently done. And that's sad. That's just terribly sad. But all that to say, there are some unseen benefits to this technology because people don't really count what is never created. Now, with that in the background, let's talk a little bit about where the anti-GMO movement is. And this is my favorite part of this presentation, just because from from my vantage point, you're just seeing them throw everything against the wall and they're hoping something sticks. Now, the most successful ploy that they've run is suing pesticide manufacturers in court. That's the best success they've had. We talked last time about the glyphosate litigation. If you're not familiar with that, Bayer very recently was up against more than 100,000 lawsuits alleging that glyphosate causes non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Most of these were settled for somewhere around $4.5 billion. And they lost 3 of these cases in court. The damages were reduced significantly, but the jury didn't decide in their favor. And then there's one case that's being appealed to the Supreme Court, and Bayer's hoping to get a ruling that says we can't be held liable for selling a product that the EPA says doesn't cause cancer. So in some of these states, like California, we have Prop 65, which would require a cancer warning on every bottle or every container of Roundup that's sold. But Bayer's argument is, well, the EPA says this doesn't cause cancer, so we would be violating federal law by complying with state law. So the idea is to get the court to rule on this and hopefully shut down a lot of this litigation. But what we're seeing from the activist groups is they're moving on from glyphosate and they're starting to attack other pesticides. And the prime target right now is another herbicide called Paraquat. And it's, except for the pesticide and the disease, which in this case is Parkinson's, exact same playbook. And we know this because Gary Ruskin, who is head of an activist group called US Right to Know, they're out here in California. He said in 2019, and he was describing some work that they had done, he said, if glyphosate, which we've been told is the safest pesticide on the market, causes cancer, what are they hiding? And he's talking about the EPA and the agriculture industry. What are they hiding about the dangers of other pesticides we know are much more toxic? And he has products in mind like Paraquat. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that there have been, to my knowledge, there's about 85 studies looking at the relationship between Paraquat and Parkinson's disease. And none of them find a conclusive link. And in fact, many of them are case control studies. So they go to people with Parkinson's and they say, hey, have you been exposed to this herbicide over your lifetime? And that's the extent of the exposure data. They ask people, have you been exposed once or multiple times or whatever? Now, the problem with this, and this is well known in epidemiology, is if you go to people with a disease and you say, hey, have you been exposed to this thing? They're gonna, in many cases, they're gonna say, oh yeah, of course, I was exposed to that. So in many cases, these studies have very, very poor exposure data. There's just no way to know. But when you do, or when researchers do better studies, like biomonitoring studies, where they look at workers at a Paraquat production facility, their rate of Parkinson's is not greater than the background rate in the surrounding population. So these are pretty conclusive studies. And if you have any integrity as a researcher, as an attorney, which that's that's iffy to say the least. It's going to be hard to make that case in court. The only way they can do this is to cherry pick particular studies, even if they have poor exposure data, and then find a scientist with some activist leanings to go into court and make this case. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen here. There's over 730 lawsuits pending in various courts primarily against Syngenta and Chevron, I believe. So I don't know what's going to happen with these. I'm hoping that we'll get some juries who will look at the evidence and say, oh, okay, maybe there's nothing here. But this is the most successful approach that they've had thus far. I don't think it's sustainable. You can only file so many lawsuits before you either run out of people, you either run out of companies to sue, or you just start losing cases. So I hope this isn't sustainable, but this is the most success they've had. The other, or one of the other approaches that they've taken, and this has been since COVID, is they've primarily US Right to Know and the Institute for Responsible Technology. It's another group affiliated with the AntiGMO project. It's a relatively small operation, but very influential within this movement. They've glommed on to the lab leak theory for the origin of SARS-CoV-2. Now, just as a side note, I think this is a reasonable explanation for where this virus came from. We probably won't ever know for certain, but it's looking that way. But the point here is that I don't think the activist groups really care about that. I think they see that this is a plausible explanation, and it has something loosely to do with genetic engineering, and they see that the public is very jaded, or large segments of the public, I should say. There's a lot of people, they're tired of mask mandates, they're tired of vaccine mandates, they're tired of this running their lives. Everything about what you do is dictated by the pandemic response policy wherever you happen to live. So these groups understand why people are frustrated, and they know that the idea that a government funding a lab that let this virus loose by accident is a powerful rhetorical weapon. And so what they're doing, and if you look at, I wrote an article recently about IRT's newsletters. So they're sending out newsletters to raise money and to attract attention to their work. They're spending a lot of time in Washington lately trying to lobby Congress regarding this issue, but they're saying, look, this gain of function stuff is really dangerous. I mean, they're genetically engineering viruses. That's just crazy. You know, this could really kill people. And there, by the way, there's all these other technologies out here, like gene edited crops and genetically modified mosquitoes. Now, in reality, these technologies have nothing to do with gain of function, because with that area of research, you're intentionally trying to make a virus potentially more dangerous so you can study how to neutralize it should it ever get out. But with these other, like with gene edited crops, I mean, the level of risk is so much lower and the regulations are so different, and the risks and benefit equation is just, it's totally different. So all they're doing really is they're saying gain of function's bad. Now look at all this other stuff that we want to ban. I don't know. We won't know the results of how this is gonna play out. I suspect that once COVID kind of fades into the background, and it looks like it might become endemic, that's what I've been hearing from some of the experts I've been reading. We won't know, but I think it's interesting that they would so drastically break from their typical talking points, because for 20, 30 years, they've been saying the same things to try to scare people about genetic engineering. And then this is one of the first times they really pushed outside of that comfort zone. Now, the final example, and this one I find personally most frustrating, but you're seeing some of these activist groups and even some people in mainstream science, they're starting to try to merge their anti-genetic engineering rhetoric with the social justice movement. And in particular, they're trying to use this theory known as post-colonialism. And they're trying, this is an old argument, but it's been revived in recent years with social justice becoming a big political and cultural issue. But they're trying to argue that when Bayer or when Syngenta or one of these big companies, when they sell seeds and pesticides to farmers in the developing world, they're trying to recolonize these countries and make them dependent on Western technology and blah, blah, blah. The argument's just so silly. I'll get into a few reasons why in just a second, but we're seeing really big names. So Scientific American ran a big story about this. It caused a huge uproar. And we responded to that on ACSH. And then Slate ran a pretty big story in 2000 or 2020 about this. And even major universities, so the University of Missouri at Kansas City, they invited Vandana Shiva to give a talk about what this worldview she has called Earth democracy. And a big part of her work is to say genetic engineering is neocolonialism. So we have major publications, major universities pushing this, and it's not really because they're sympathetic to anti-GMO activism, but they're sympathetic to the social justice work. Okay. Now, in reality, and we all probably know this already, but in reality, we're not talking about colonialism. What we're talking about is trade. We're talking about farmers that recognize the benefits of this technology, companies that produce the technology, and then you have an exchange, and that's really all it is. And they're trying to say that there's a power imbalance because these companies are big and farmers are small. But you know, I bought a Toyota last year, and Toyota has way more money and influence than I'll ever have. But I have a nice car now. You know, there's no oppression involved in that exchange, and it's the same thing with agricultural products. And we know this because if you look in like in India a couple of years ago, the government still hasn't approved herbicide tolerant cotton, and the farmers are mad about this because, you know, they want these herbicide tolerant crops. So they acquired the seed illegally, and they went out very publicly and they said, here's the seed, I'm putting it in the ground. You can arrest me if you want, because we're done with these stupid regulations. We see the same thing in South America. They're not really doing it in protest, but they acquire insect-resistant BT corn illegally. They plant it and they go, hey, our yields are way better. This is great. And I know a scientist down there, and what she's told me is that everyone knows this is happening. The regulators know it's happening, but they don't want to punish the farmers because that doesn't look good. But then they don't want to celebrate what they're doing because, when you celebrate law breaking, that doesn't look good to voters. The biotech industry knows it's happening, but they, for the same reasons, they don't want to get involved in anything that could be construed as illegal. And the activist groups down there, they know what's happening, but they don't want to promote it because it makes their cause look bad. So all that to say, we know farmers want this technology. This idea of colonialism is silly. And as we talked about earlier, the economic benefits are enormous, particularly for people in developing countries. And they know this, right? They know when their yields are better. They know when they're spending less on inputs. So the whole thing is it's nonsense from top to bottom. And I think just personally, real social justice means alleviating poverty, because poverty is what kills people. It's really the root of many of these issues that we complain about that people struggle with in the developing world. So if we can give them a more abundant food supply and make it easier for them to produce right, so farmers get lower production costs, consumers get cheaper food. This is a big deal. It's not going to solve all these issues on its own, but it's a significant step in the right direction.
And it helps them become self-sufficient. So they're not relying on handouts from Western nations.
Correct. Yeah, it's exactly the opposite. And it's the same thing with international trade more generally. Everybody benefits from trade in terms of economic growth. It's bad, like you wouldn't do it, right? There wouldn't be a market for this, in other words, and we don't have to belabor that point, but we all know it's true. So even though they're trying to regain their former glory, if you will, the anti-GMO movement, it's still in retreat. And there's a few reasons I think this is the case. So in 2020, the Sierra Club, which is a major environmentalist organization, you're probably all familiar with them, they came out and they very cautiously endorsed the use of a genetically engineered chestnut tree, which it's been in development for years, but the USDA is right on the cusp of approving it for replanting in forests up and down the eastern seaboard, because the chestnut's been all but eliminated by a deadly blight that spread and just wiped out all the trees. So the technology it's probably going to be approved. I don't know just yet, but the Sierra Club came out and they said, on balance, we're not crazy about GMOs, but this is an excellent application of this technology, so we support it. And that caused a lot of uproar. And then I want to say just a few months later, maybe the Union of Concerned Scientists, which has traditionally been a very, very vocal opponent of biotechnology, they came out and they endorsed the Impossible Burger, which is a plant-based genetically engineered meat substitute. Now, their complaint is that, well, industrial agriculture is ruining the planet. I don't think that's the case if you just look at the evidence. But in any case, because they're concerned about factory farming, quote, factory farming, they're saying, look, we don't love GMOs either, but this is a way to get people to eat less meat. So whatever their motivations, I'm not really all that interested in. The point is that we're seeing major names within this movement endorsing the technology. And just like back in 2009, for example, UCS put out a major report. It was called Failure to Yield. It was widely panned by every scientist that looked at it because they did some funny business with the numbers. But they've all but given up on that route of attack. And then finally, if you guys have questions or you want to talk about anything, we can do that. But just last year, the United Kingdom came out and they said, we are going to relax our restrictions on crop gene editing. And as a part of helping them get there, I wrote a report for the Adam Smith Institute. They're based in London. They're a libertarian think tank. And we made the case that, well, this is a good first step. Gene editing is good. There's lots of small plant breeding firms that want to get into this market if you would just let them. But you need to embrace GMOs as well. And I went through a lot of the evidence that I just discussed earlier. I mean, the evidence is very clear. This technology is beneficial. And what DEFRA has said is that we want to take a look at our GMO regulations, but that's later on down the line. We want to deal with gene editing now because there still is a pretty significant anti-GMO movement in the UK and in the European Union. But all that to say, that's a significant development because the UK for decades has foregone the benefits of this technology entirely. I mean, they import lots of soy primarily from the United States, which is all genetically engineered. So their animals eat it, humans eat the products that are made from the animals. so they eat products of genetic engineering, but they won't let their farmers use it. And that's finally changing. I think they just looked at the numbers and they said, wow, this has cost us something on the order of $1 billion. What are we doing? So this is a really, really significant development because when you see major governments change policy, everybody else looks at that, so countries in the developing world will look at that and they'll go, oh, well, that's interesting, because that's a potential major trading partner. And that's one of the reasons a lot of countries in Africa would not approve genetically engineered crops for so long is because the European Union said, if you grow this, we won't buy it from you. So that eliminated a huge incentive for them. But with the UK changing and in fact, there's 28 countries around the world now that grow biotech crops, and most of them are developing countries. So overall, this is very good news. We're making great progress. Of course, the fight isn't over because these activist groups won't give up. But in any case, but I'm excited with what we're seeing. But I'll stop there. If you guys want to talk about anything, I'm happy to.
A quick thing, you kind of touched on it, but they at first were using ecological and environmental things as a reason to not adopt GMO crops. But in fact, Brazil is actually using bioengineered crops more because it's helping them regain some of the rainforest as a result, because they need less real estate to grow their crops, and they're actually yielding 35% more crops than they did 25 years ago. So there's that benefit too. It's actually ecologically more beneficial than the traditional crops. It also usually, most of them require less water. They have additives in them that are nutritionally beneficial, as you pointed out. Some of them need less pesticides. Some of them need less fertilizer, less water, which is a precious, rare resource that we're always having problems with, particularly out in California, where a lot of our food comes from. So there are lots of benefits we're finding out, that not just the economic benefits, but actual ecological benefits as well.
I second everything you just said.
I've got a point of information. What's the difference between gene editing and then making GMOs?
Yeah, good question. So typically when you're doing genetic engineering or genetic modification, you're breeding a transgenic crop. So you're moving DNA between different species. And that's what scares a lot of people, is because then you get DNA is DNA. But if you can say they're importing foreign DNA into your favorite food, that scares a lot of people. With gene editing, typically what you're doing is you're just modifying existing DNA. And that's why the UK isn't particularly concerned about it. Because if you just go in with CRISPR and you make a very discrete change that makes the crop, gives it a trait that it didn't have before, that's basically more efficient plant breeding. So people aren't as scared of that. But there is a technical distinction. There's no safety distinction between them, but that's the issue that concerns most people.
I have a related question. Henry Miller, I assume you know him. You're in the same camp with Henry, respected friend and colleague and a friend of this organization. He, if I am reporting correctly, feels that GMO is an unfortunate, limiting, and a more frightening acronym. And he tries in his writing, as you know, to broaden it to just say not even gene editing, but genetic engineering. Is this important or not? Or would the same people who were scared of GMOs be just as scared of a broader term like genetic engineering?
Yeah, great question. I wholeheartedly agree with him. I think one of the mistakes that's been made in science communication very recently, in fact, is to try to separate gene editing from transgenics in the way I just described, because a lot of scientists, a lot of people in science communication said, well, look, we can totally avoid the whole GMO thing. And Henry is one of the people who's been pushing back on this, but I know other scientists as well who have said, look, what we need to do is we need to start with gene editing, and then we need to argue back in defense of transgenics, because we need to say, anytime you breed a crop, you're shuffling its DNA. There are thousands upon thousands of random mutations in the foods you eat. There's no way to account for this, and you're not scared of it at all. You know, like typical plant breeding, all sorts of mutations, even the organic and the non-GMO project certified. It's a marketing facade. It's all a charade. So Henry, I think, and he's taken some guff for doing this, but he's one of the people. He's like, look, we can't back away from this. We have let these people dominate the conversation for too long, and we just need to say enough is enough. So I wholeheartedly agree.
Well, the next step is to say genetically improved GI food. How's that?
I've heard enhanced. Any words are powerful. So anything you can do to adjust it, I would support it.
Can I ask you what you started with? And I'm not sure that I heard correctly about the tomato. It has, what extra does it have in it?
It has an amino acid called GABA. I'll put a link to it.
GABA, I mean, has a lot of effects in the brain. Does it get to the brain? Anyway, my question is, you say it can lower blood pressure.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, there can be problems with that if you don't need your blood pressure lowered.
Sure.
So,
Right.
So what kind of tests and measures do you do to make sure it's not going to cause postural hypertension or whatever?
Sure, it's not, as from what I understand, the increase, it's not enough to have a major impact in that way. And if you look at some of the research in that article that I just put in the chat, the idea is it's primarily preventative. So like in many cases, people they don't eat enough fruits and vegetables, so they don't get the benefit anyway. So if they eat a little bit of this tomato, it makes a difference. And it would be comparable to supplementation. And there's a lot of supplements you can buy at the drugstore that are useless, or maybe even worse than useless. But there's some pretty good research on GABA supplementation. And that's what the regulators in Japan did. They said, well, gene editing, it's glorified plant breeding, and people can also buy GABA supplements. So if you put it in a food, we don't see the problem with this.
No, but it does raise some problems. I mean, you get GABA supplements and you're buying GABA supplements, but if you're just buying tomatoes, is it going to be labeled that it has extra GABA or that?
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if the regulators are requiring it in this case, but I know Sanitec, if you go to their website, and this is another marketing sort of a reverse the non-GMO thing, is certain companies are coming out and they're saying, not only is biotechnology not bad, it's excellent. And here's why we use it. And here's how we made this tomato. Here's how we make this fish, so people are going to be aware of it, but I don't think there's reason to be concerned that people are going to be walking around.
Well, if you can do that, maybe they'll start enhancing, say, plants with something that is more pharmacologically active. And is that going to be a problem?
I don't think it'll be a problem. There's work being done like that. There's talk of edible vaccines, for example. But when you get into that range, that would go through clinical trials. The FDA
Yeah.
wouldn't say, like, oh yeah, it's a smallpox vaccine in a tomato. Help yourself. This would be very carefully studied before it was
Yeah,
approved.
yes, yeah. Okay, thank you.
I have another question. It seems to me that these lawsuits, as frivolous sounding as a lot of them are, there's no reason they're not going to continue forever unless there's a possibility of some sort of countersuit. There's got to be a price to pay when they bring these suits. I don't know if it quite can characterize them as nuisance lawsuits, but when they keep on springing up all these suits, even after things have been scientifically shown to be not harmful, I mean, can't there be some push? If there's no pushback, I don't see them ever stopping.
There have been flares put up in DC about 25 years ago, trying to adopt England's rule of the loser pays. Because what a lot of these lawyers do is jury shop. And they just keep at it till they find a jury that's sympathetic and basically present the same case they've been presenting the other 11 times. McDonald's coffee is the best example I know of, where the guy jury shopped 11 times and then finally won a major decision in Arizona, claiming that McDonald's coffee was too hot and caused his client to be scalded. And so McDonald's slaps a warning label on. They did get the amount reduced. But it was still, the lawyer would not have been allowed to continually jury shop if he had to pay the court costs of McDonald's each time he had lost the previous 10 times.
Mhm.
He would have gone bankrupt. But most of my friends in the public interest law movement that are labeled as free market, those lawyers really don't want that either, because they say that it doesn't give the little guy a chance in the court system. And so that's why they say America's court system is superior to the UK's court system, because the little guy actually has a chance in the courts because of the ability to not have to pay damages when they lose the case. But that would be the best way to take care of it.
Doesn't seem like it doesn't seem like it's I guess part of the problem is also the science. I've always viewed that if a judge doesn't throw out science that's either junk science, or even if it's not junk science, science that doesn't meet a certain pretty stringent hurdle, if the judge doesn't throw it out, then he's putting his thumb on the scale of the other side, because the jury is now being told that that is a legitimate scientific argument. The jury's going to think if it wasn't rational, then they wouldn't have let us hear it. So, it's
And there are corrupt
terrible.
scientists too. You've got the Irk case with glyphosate, where scientists that have been paid, was it like $165,000 from trial lawyers? Basically, he got into IARC's review boards and took out most of the positive studies that had been done about glyphosate, showing how safe it was, and put in a couple that made it look like it was a possible, because IARC has 3 different levels: possible, probable, and definitely cancer causing, I think, are the 3 levels. So this one was the lowest of the levels, but still, because the word possible is there, it gets banned by California's prop, and it causes a lot of problems. But that was because this guy got into the review process and corrupted it. And actually, as a result of that, the US Congress defunded IARC from the US money. But it didn't take long for that to flip around when Congress changed hands. And so, there's a lot of money involved. And so if there's so much room for corruption.
Yeah, but in order to win a case, doesn't the jury have to find not just that it's possible that it caused cancer? Don't they have a higher standard before you can make someone pay?
In a criminal trial, yes. It has to
No, I'm
have a
talking
higher
about in a
standard,
civil
but in a
trial.
civil trial, you don't have to have that burden of proof. It doesn't
Well,
have
it
to
has
be
to be
beyond a reasonable
51%.
doubt.
It has to be more likely rather than less likely. So that's essentially 51%.
Well, but it's not possible.
And when the
But
argument-
jury, yeah, and then there you got it, so the jury is, if it's possible and the jury wants the big guy to pay, then it's, you couldn't. Okay, got it.
So that's that.
Hmm.
Anyway, any other questions?
Can I ask a question that's a little bit off topic? It's more with pesticides than GMO.
Sure.
Sure.
I've heard some things that I read all the ACSH. I think it's wonderful, all the stuff about organic. It's just really meaningful to me. It gives me ammunition when I talk to my crazy organic friends. But there's I've heard people are convinced that when it comes to pesticides in berries, like strawberries and whatever, that the pesticide infuses into the berry and you can't wash it off.
Totally false. Well, there's a long wrong with it. So the first thing is that the USDA, the FDA, they both do monitoring of pesticide residues on food. And in order to do any potential, even to have a biological effect, not even necessarily a harmful effect, you'd have to eat more strawberries than your stomach could ever hold. So in other words, whether or not you can wash the pesticide residue off is immaterial. It's just, analytical chemistry is so good these days, you can detect almost anything, almost anywhere. And that's what groups like the Environmental Working Group and these other activist groups, this is what they rely on, is they can hire a lab to detect, some insecticide on a strawberry, and then they get attention from CNN and everybody freaks out. But the reality is these are very carefully studied. And even when the pesticides when the EPA gives the company a registration, they have to figure out at what level is the pesticide potentially harmful. And then they set the tolerance 10 times below that typically. And depending on the active ingredient, sometimes it's even lower. So, these things are just so thoroughly studied because the reality is nobody wants to get sick. Nobody wants their kids to get sick. And the foolishness that these groups have peddled to people is that, no, see, the EPA is compromised and these big companies, they don't care about your health. They just want to sell chemicals. And it's kind of like an episode of Captain Planet. If you've ever seen that cartoon show, it's like, this is the grown-up version of Captain Planet. It's so at odds with reality. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And it's kind of the precautionary principle on steroids, which is, without digressing, that's kind of what's destroyed everything going on with COVID. The precautionary principle, as Cuomo said, I'll do anything to prevent one person from dying from COVID. What he left out was, even if it kills another 100 people in the process.
Now that's a whole nother topic, but maybe we could talk about that sometime, because I have lots of thoughts on that.
I just wanted to thank you guys for the presentation. And one of the things that I was really excited to hear about is the golden rice story. Here's an initiative. Nobody's trying to get rich on it. They're trying to come up with a wonderful thing for the planet that really works. And I'm so glad to see that it's finally seeing the light of day. As a nutrition guy, I understand the consequences of vitamin A deficiency, and it was a crime that was waylaid for as long as it was.
Yeah, the guy that invented golden rice just gave the patent away for anybody to use it.
I know, they didn't
Just
even. That was just so amazing.
Yeah, that was just like the two guys that invented insulin did the same thing.
It was more than that though, because there was technology from Syngenta and Monsanto involved.
Right.
And both companies gave up the patents. And in fact, if you read the golden rice license, it specifically says the technology can only be used in publicly on rice. Now, that whether or not that is a good idea is, I think, a discussion for another day. But the point is that they just gave it away. They even said, no one's going to make a profit on this. And that's one of the arguments that the post-colonialist folks make, is they say, look, you're trying to sneak in and take over these countries with your golden rice. But if you look at the license, they're just giving it away. Nobody's making any money on golden rice.
Is this Norman Borlaug just enhanced what, I mean, he's becoming more of a household name now as one of the first people, but it's really just genetically doing what he was doing before?
The improvements that he was behind, they weren't genetic engineering. They were just crossbreeding primarily. The stuff today is a little bit more advanced, but it's the same concept really. The idea is you give farmers seed that performs better, you know, whether it's the insect resistance or pesticide tolerance, or with the gene editing stuff, they're getting into some different traits now, but it's more or less the same. The idea is just help farmers grow more efficiently, and then there's more food and less suffering, which is awesome.
I've wondered if Norman Borlaug were alive today or just starting out, whether he would have been as effective, since all these organizations are so firmly entrenched. Might they not have been fighting him as well?
I don't know. It's a good question. I think what stuns me is you will see outlets like PBS and reputable companies and organizations. They will give a platform to these people, and they will say silly things like, Borlaug's work divorced people from the sources of their food. And my response always is, well, what food? They were dying. This mass starvation, it's tragic. There's nothing.
I've got an issue with calling PBS a reputable organization.
Yeah, but you understand what I mean. Like when you ask people about PBS, they go, "Oh, I watch PBS in the classroom." But all that to say, you have I don't call them mainstream, I call them the corporate press, but you have these corporate media outlets that will give attention to this stuff. And I find that stunning, especially with all the concern these days about misinformation. That's a very hit or miss sort of a standard.
But it does play into what the media has always done, which is sell papers by scaring people. That's a great way to sell your paper.
It leads. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I'll just say thank you, Cameron. You're new to the organization since I was active, and but nonetheless, I'm pleased that you're doing all that good work, and I enjoy reading you.
Hey, thank you very much. I appreciate
Keep up the good work.
And he's half the age, of the rest of us here at the staff.
Yes.
Well, that's good. I'm glad there's some young people coming up. Good.
Anybody else have anything else?
No.
Thank you all again.
Cameron.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cameron, and look forward to seeing you all again next month. If you guys have any suggestions for a topic you'd like discussed, please feel free to email me, and I'm happy to have that as the centerpiece of discussion. And remember, in these discussions, you can bring up anything you'd like at any time during the discussion. So that's why I don't mute people like my yoga instructor does when class starts, because I want everyone to be able to chime in whenever they feel like they want to. So again, thanks everyone, and look forward to seeing you all again. Take care.
Yeah, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll see you guys.